Famicom Detective Club The Missing Heir is one of the two games released as part of the Famicom Detective Club remasters. Remasters of adventure games released in the 80s on the Famicom, but not just the regular Famicom that we here in the West know as the NES. It was released on its peripheral, the Famicom Disk System, an add-on that allowed the Famicom to read floppy disks. This add-on though never came to the West and subsequently the games for it also, meaning this remaster is actually the first time we see any of these Famicom detective games in the West. Smash Bros doesn't count. Now, as to why I decided to play The Missing Heir first, even though chronologically it takes place after the other game, The Girl Who Stands Behind, well, first because I had no idea. I was trying to go as blind as possible into the story, so I didn't read anything about it, and so my criteria for deciding which one to play first was made on the fact that back in the day, The Missing Heir was the game that came out first. Now, I'm gonna try not to spoil anything, but hopefully the review makes a bit of sense of why they decided to make the sequel a prequel, but this is still just a review of The Missing Heir. So let's get on with it. Starting with the story. In The Missing Heir, you play as yourself. Well, you get to name your character, which is always a bit weird when the character will always just look a certain way. Here, a teenage boy detective, which to be fair was probably the target audience of the game, teenage boys, not detectives, when it was originally released. But also still weird that you can pick his name, in my opinion. Regardless though, the story here starts with amnesia. Yes, of course it does, as you get rescued from a cliff where you were found injured and without a memory, of course. Here, the amnesia being used for various plot devices as the story gets an excuse to explain you very basic things even though you are an already established detective in this world, which is a very common trope that has been very overused in games, but in the defense of this game, the original story was written in the 80s where this trope was not as common, and that's worth taking into consideration even if it doesn't change your perception of it while playing it now in current year. Regardless, the other thing this amnesia is used for is the fact that the game starts mid-investigation, so to say. And of course, you don't remember major things that happened before it, and a big part of the story will be trying to recover those memories. And that's simply a much more interesting way to use this trope and definitely helps it justify the other reason for using it a lot better in my opinion. Now, to what the actual investigation is about. Well, it's a murder mystery where you're brought to this small village where the resident old rich family has had their head of the family die unexpectedly. The authorities rule the death to be caused by a heart failure, but the butler doesn't believe so, and so he's the one that brings you here to try and resolve this. Without spoiling then, from here it follows a very familiar formula with this sort of the detective stories where you slowly uncover pieces that help you build the full events and also theorize on who the killer might be, with occasional events that change the current thought process of the game. And by that I mean who you might theorize is the killer and how the clues add up for you to think that way. The way games control this information varies a lot with very different techniques, and a lot of them deriving from literature, and of course the best ones find ways to feed you this information in organic but maybe even more importantly subtle ways to give you an illusion of actually solving this, even though you're obviously always working within the restraints of a video game. But subtlety is something that this game can struggle with in some ways, for example with red herrings. For those who might not know, red herring is a clue that is meant to mislead you from the truth by taking advantage of how you process information. A great example of a red herring is in the first Harry Potter book or movie. Spoilers, by the way. In that story, they lead you to think Professor Snape is the bad guy through his demeanor and character and some of his actions. Meanwhile, the real villain is a very weak, shy, and unassuming character. And through this example, you can see the way red herrings use your assumptions of human behavior to mislead. And the logic of the red herring is not something that this game lacks at all, it's more in the subtlety of how it's done, which to be fair could also be a criticism for the example I just pointed out, but that's not the point. The point is, in my opinion though, the constant assertion of the red herring and the lack of resistance of the other characters to the red herring, it becomes a bit too obvious that there has to be something else to the story. And with that, the red herring becomes too obvious, which I believe it shouldn't be, because then every time it's alluded to, I'm just aware of the facade. It's not a bad herring per se, but hopefully I made it understandable in how it can bring the story down. The other problem I have with the story is a bit too spoilery, but I'll try to explain it without spoiling. Well, basically, throughout the game you'll keep revisiting areas that just seem to have no use for the active plot. The reason for this becomes apparent at the end, which would be a good thing usually. The thing is, these scenes don't really add much and are more just justified by the end than nothing else. It's not like if I played this game again I would suddenly have a new context to the things that were said in these seemingly normal conversations. What do you get is simply a new context on the characters saying them, which gives them a different motive for saying them, which is fine but not something very special. It's even hard not to think like the scenes themselves only exist so the ending doesn't feel out of nowhere, which the ending can feel very anticlimactic. For me it did, at least, even if it's not a bad ending per se. I mean, by the end of it, all of it is well explained and justified, but it just wasn't very exciting. Overall though, it's a fine story. It's well told, and one of my favorite things about it actually, it's how grounded it is. Aside from the teenage detective thing, it's not that far off from something that could actually happen in real life, and in that way it's actually pretty interesting. But I do have one final hitch with the story, and that is the pacing. But I think that pertains more to the gameplay, which we will talk about now. Missing Heir is an investigation adventure game with a presentation very similar to the visual novel genre, to the point where I think categorizing it as a visual novel would not be an incorrect opinion. Most of the game is reading dialogue options, except instead of normal dialogue option, it's mostly questions about topics because you're a detective trying to solve a case. On screen, you almost always have a menu that allows you to do actions depending on the scene. There are quite a few of them, but there are 5 main ones that you'll see the most, which are talk, which allows you to talk and ask questions to whatever person you're directed to. Then we have call/engage. With this one you can switch between characters that you're talking to in a scene. Then we have look/examine, very self-explanatory. You can look around the scene and examine specific parts. Then a less obvious one, we have remember, which often doesn't do anything, but it's supposedly so you can have a moment of reflection on the information you received and deduce something from it. But this simply does not get used a lot. And then the 5th one is quit investigation, which basically is a save and quit feature. But then we have a bunch of other ones that also show up, just maybe a little bit less often because they are a lot more contextual but still important things, like take, which is used to pick something up on the scene, or open, to open a door, or the more common one, travel, when you can freely move between scenes. As many times you can just pick where you go first and move freely from area to area as you get information in one place that is relevant to another one. And this working well with the chapters of this game, as each chapter is about a day of in-game time. So as you travel around, you spend a day investigating, so to say. Important to mention about these actions though is sometimes they may do different things because of a scripted action, like the call engage option being used to actually shout out and call for someone. It's fairly creative and sometimes a bit too creative. For example, even the quit investigation button is used to progress with the plot at one point in the story. Which leads me to talk about the issue that I had with the pacing. Progressing the story is all about acquiring information, but sometimes you have to do it in a very specific order, which can lead to some odd moments. Like, for example, if I want to ask something very specific but the game wants me to ask about about something else first. It will just pretend they don't know anything about the first thing I asked, even though they do, and this can lead to me thinking that they don't, leading me to think they actually don't know anything and not ask about that thing again, when in reality the game really just wanted me to ask for something else first. It's not rare for characters in this game to go, "Oh yeah, I do know something about that actually," which is annoying, and it gets more complicated, especially when you're managing between multiple areas, to a point where sometimes it can really feel like you're just stumbling through the dark, especially again with those moments where certain options trigger an event rather than doing what they usually do. And this wouldn't really be a problem if it wasn't so annoying and at points needless, as this game sometimes does do a good job in leading you where it wants to go through the dialogue by throwing hints, especially in the final sentences. But even with these clues, I think a little bit more of freedom in what order you ask things would have been better for the pacing overall. Final thing I want to mention then about the dialogue is the skip feature, because, well, be careful with it. It's very fast and you can skip a lot of text by accident, since it's located on the L button on the Switch, which for me it's where I often end up resting my index finger. And what happened was, at the end of a chapter, where you usually get a quick reminder of the information you got throughout the chapter, I, well, accidentally skipped right through it, which could have been worse. It could have been an actual part of the story, but just be careful. Now, to finish this bit off then, it feels almost impossible to judge the gameplay without the context of the story, but it's okay in my opinion. The pacing could be better, but it also does some interesting things that keep it from being just another visual novel. Moving on to the graphics then. And this game looks really good. It's fairly simple anime aesthetic with the characters and world, but as it seems to be going for a realistic look, and because it has a lot of detail in each scene, I think it works out again with that grounded feeling of the story. Overall it's good, and it runs good, which you'd hope out of a visual novel. Soundtrack wise, it's also good. They're actually remakes of the original, which is pretty interesting and impressive if nothing else. But yeah, I don't think there was anything here that particularly stood out about them, besides that small tidbit about them being remakes, but I still like them. Still talking about the sound though, the game is only in Japanese for the voice acting, which is fine. I personally don't mind it, but it might be something that matters to you. Overall though, Famicom Detective Club is an old story brought to a modern era, and in a lot of ways it does show its age, but in others it shows some aspects that are still pretty unique and worth experiencing to this day. Like how the whole story, even though dealing with various things of the occult, still grounding itself in a very realistic setting, and overall I enjoyed my time with it despite its issues. And for that I'm giving Famicom Detective Club The Missing Heir a 6 out of 10. It's very close to a 7, but it just didn't get there for me. I would still recommend it though if you're looking for a more realistic crime investigation story, as it's surprisingly unique for that. But I would also wait maybe for my review of the second game, The Girl Who Stands Behind, which I think will give more context in which one you would prefer over the two, unless you're from Europe like me, where you can only buy the bundle that comes with both games for some reason, which is very weird. And as we're speaking of availability though, $35 for each is in my opinion a bit steep for a 7-hour visual novel game. Even $60 for both of them, which adds up to about 14 hours of visual novel, is not an amazing value in my opinion. So honestly, if you want my personal opinion to you, I would say just wait for a really hefty discount if you really want to play them. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that this helped you with it, and regardless of that, I hope that you enjoyed watching. If so, please consider subscribing and liking, even commenting, all things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.